So my name's Bea, and I'm from Northumbria University, and I'm just going to tell you a bit about my PhD project, which is looking at the importance of urban trees for pollinators. And I tried to think of a more catchy name, or towers of flowers. So who am I? That's a picture of me. I did my undergraduate degree and my master's degree at the University of Sussex in Brighton, and that's where I kind of started to look at the importance of pollinators and how urbanisation can impact pollinators. I then went on to be a research assistant at Northumbria University, where I was looking at pollination services in sub-Saharan Africa. And now I'm doing my PhD, and I'm doing it on a One Planet doctoral training programme at Northumbria University and Newcastle University. And my research is funded by the Natural Environment Research Council and the British Beekeepers Association. I'm also supported by supervisors at Northumbria and Newcastle, and you can kind of see the whole team listed here. So going back to my research question, the importance of trees for pollinators in an urban landscape, if you break it down a bit further, there's three elements to the question. So we're looking at the urban landscape, we're looking at trees, and we're looking at pollinators, and we're looking at how these three interact. So I'm going to kind of go into a little bit of background about each of these three elements, and then we'll put it all together and look at what I'm going to be doing this summer. So I think you all probably know about pollinators. I think you've had a few talks on pollination and pollinators in this talk series. But what I mean by pollinators in this case is I'm looking at insect pollination. So an insect pollinator is anything that transfers pollen between the male and the female parts of the flower, and this is what enables the flower to reproduce. So, of course, there's other means of pollination. So there's self-pollination and wind pollination, and there's other pollinators apart from insect pollinators. So birds, rodents, reptiles, squirrels, monkeys, and if everything else fails, people can pollinate, but hopefully we won't have to get there. But what I'm talking about is insect pollinators. So that's bumblebees, honeybees, solitary bees, butterflies, beetles, hoverflies, other flies, wasps, and a whole host of things. You've also probably heard about the pollinator decline. I think the media kind of termed this more like the bee decline, but actually declines have been reported for all key pollinator groups. So that's everything that I've just mentioned. So the IUCN have some really good stats to explain the pollinator decline. So about a third of bee and butterfly populations are declining. About 20% of threatened bee species are endemic. So endemic means that this species only exists in one restricted area. So if 20% of the threatened bee species only exist in this, in specific areas, this is really scary because if they go extinct in this area, they don't exist anywhere else. So that means they'd be extinct globally. And 10% of bee and butterfly species are endangered. So these stats are only looking at bee and butterfly species because that's what we have kind of the biggest record of in Europe, but there's declines in all of the insect pollinator groups. So why are they declining? Probably due to a whole host of reasons, but the main ones are thought to be climate change, intensive agricultural management, which can involve pesticide use, land use change and the loss of habitats, invasive alien species and diseases, and environmental pollution. But what we're going to focus on is land use change and the loss of habitats. And this is because urbanisation is a major driver of land use change. So this is how urbanisation and the pollinator declines are kind of linked. So just to go through why urbanisation is thought to have negative effects on pollinators. So if you've got a native forest or a natural area and we stick a road through it or a load of buildings or any other urban features, what this can cause is a decrease in native plant species as we clear areas to make room for these urban features. So we also tend to plant cultivated species or non-native species or exotic species in our gardens and parks, and these might not be so suited to our native pollinator species. Urbanisation can also cause something called habitat fragmentation, which is where we reduce connectivity of pollinator habitats. So if a pollinator wants to get from one habitat to another and there's loads of roads or tall buildings in between, it can be really difficult, or there might be less plant species in between. Urbanisation also causes something called the urban heat island effect, and this means that the temperature in towns and cities can be a bit higher than in more rural areas. So This is just because roads and buildings that we put in can absorb and retain heat really effectively, and it means that the temperature is much higher, well, not much higher, a bit higher in towns and cities. So this might not be so suited to our pollinator species. So this is an issue now because urban populations are rapidly increasing. So if urbanisation has negative effects on our pollinators and urban populations are increasing, this could have really negative effects on our pollinators. So over half the world's population now lives in urban areas, and this trend is expected to continue. So it's expected that 70% of the world's population will be living in urban areas by 2050. So as more of the world becomes urbanised, we really need to try and reduce the negative impacts of these urban areas on pollinators. So why do we care about having robust pollinator communities in urban areas? So you probably can think of these, but wildflower pollination, so any of our wildflowers or any of the flowers you plant in your gardens, we need pollinator communities to pollinate these flowers. Same with crop pollination and intrinsic or cultural benefits. I think Dave Goulson said he just likes having pollinator communities, so there shouldn't really be a reason why we need to. So there's been a lot of kind of research interest in these urban impacts on our pollinators. So just to go through what past studies have found. So studies have found that as you increase urbanisation, there can be a decrease in the number of species of pollinators. So as you move from a more rural area to a more urban area, the number of pollinator species can decrease. One study, though, compared urban areas and farmland, and they did find that urban areas had a higher number of bee species. So this kind of highlights that there could be, urban areas could be really important habitats for our bees. Urbanisation changes the composition of pollinator species, so it changes the numbers and the different species of pollinators that we have in our urban areas because of this alteration of the plant species. So the decreasing of native species and increasing of kind of maybe more exotic or non-native species can change which pollinators can exist in our urban areas. And there's generally thought to be a shift from pollinators with a specialist diet, so pollinators who are kind of more fussy eaters might just be able to forage on one or two species. So generalists can do much better in urban areas, so species which can forage on a wider variety of species. So the third element to the question is trees. So why do we care about trees? So one tree can produce up to thousands of flowers. And this is important because a study has compared tree species and like equivalent sized patches of wildflower meadow. And what they found is that trees could provide up to 10 times the nectar production of an equivalent sized patch of wildflower meadow. So that's not to say that wildflower meadow isn't important, but it just means we really need to make sure that we also concentrate on what trees are providing for pollinators. Trees also flower during the highest nectar and pollen demand, so they provide crucial resources at a really crucial time, and they're already widely planted in urban areas. So we've kind of been through the three elements of the question, so trees, urban landscapes, and pollinators. So if we kind of put those together, we can look at why I'm looking at this and what I'm going to be doing. So if this is our urban park and I was going to do an urban pollinator study, I'd kind of walk through the park, I'd record all the species of flower that I might see, all the species of pollinator that I might see, and make my mind up of whether this is like a good area for pollinators or a bad area, and how we should increase plant species or different flower species for pollinators. But that means we're just kind of looking at this area. So what are we missing? We're missing the thousands of flowers that are produced by trees. So really, not many of the urban pollinator studies in the UK have included any of our tree species. They do sometimes stretch up to about 2 meters, so they include sometimes the lower branches of the trees. But when you look at what we're missing thousands of flowers and likely thousands of plant-pollinator interactions in our trees. This is understandable because if you think about how tall the trees are in your local park, they can be up to about 40 meters tall, so it's really difficult to see what's going on up there. But this means that when we're suggesting what flowers to plant for pollinator conservation, we're not really sure which trees we should plant for which pollinators. So this is kind of why I came to my question, what is the importance of trees for pollinators in an urban landscape? So I started my PhD about 1.5 years ago, and last year we did a lot of pilot studies, kind of putting the methods together and figuring out what we're going to do. So the majority of my research is going to happen this summer, so I don't have any results to share with you. Maybe next year I can come back and share what I find. But I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do and how we're going to do it. So there's two kind of areas of research that I'm mainly looking at. So it's these things called Plant-Pollinator Interactions and tree floral resources. So if we concentrate on the first one, what I mean by a plant-pollinator interaction is this mutualism where pollinators collect fruit from flowers, and in doing so they transfer pollen grains between the plants, allowing plant reproduction. So what a plant-pollinator interaction means in practice is if I was doing a pollinator survey, I might stand with my quadrat on the floor and observe what's going on in my quadrat. So if I was just looking at which pollinators were in that area or not, I might record a pollinator every time it kind of flew past me or landed on the grass. But for a plant-pollinator interaction, I want to know which plant species are important for which specific pollinators, not just whether a pollinator's there or not. So I would record a pollinator when it landed on a plant, so when it interacted with a plant, and I'd record that foraging interaction. And what that allows you to do is put all your pollinator species along the top and all of your plant species along the bottom. And these connections here represent the foraging interactions between the pollinators and the plants. So I can see which plants are important for which pollinators. And this lets you make really effective and specific recommendations on which plants you should plant for pollinator conservation. So this is, just for illustration purposes, this isn't based on any data that I've collected, but just to show you what you could find out from this. So if you, say, reduce this buttercup species here, you can also see that all of the interactions would disappear. So this tells you that if you look, this bumblebee species might have been foraging on a daisy, buttercup, and a dandelion. And when I reduce the interactions there, I can see it's still got some forage species, so it's still probably doing okay. But when you look at this butterfly was only foraging on this buttercup, and now it has a lot less forage. So this shows us that possibly if something happened to this buttercup species, this could decrease the numbers of our butterfly or decrease the forage of our butterflies. So what I want to do is look at this, but in trees. So to get around this issue where the trees are really tall and I'm really small and I can't see what's going on, I've done a tree climbing course. So I've done the course that tree surgeons do to be able to access the tree canopies. So I'll actually do this and climb the trees and sit in the canopy and do my plant pollinator observations. So I'll be using this method, which is by the UK pollinator monitoring scheme, called a flower insect time count. And it just means I'll sit on a branch and stare at a flower for a set amount of time and record all the interactions between that flower and which pollinators visit it. So that means that if you look back at our network, I'll just be able to add in trees to these networks, because previously trees have never been included in these networks, and be able to see which connections they make with our pollinators. So hopefully we should be able to make more effective tree planting schemes for pollinators in urban areas. Where are we going to do this? So I think you had a talk from Ed Chivers, who is in charge of the Beelines project from Urban Green Newcastle. The Beelines project is just trying to increase or improve our urban parks for pollinators. I think they're trying to plant a set amount of trees and bulbs and increase the nectar production in our urban parks. So this is a picture of some of our undergraduate students doing some ground level surveys. So we already have ground level data for some of the parks in the Beelines project, and these are the parks I'll use for my pollinator sampling. So now just focusing on the second point, which is tree floral resources. This is kind of the other area I'm going to study. So what are tree floral resources? Nectar and pollen. So nectar is mainly sugar, and it's the major carbohydrate in the diet of many pollinating insects. And pollen would be the major source of protein in the diet of many pollinating insects. So I want to look at the quality and the quantity of tree floral resources. So in a study, beekeepers ranked poor nutrition and starvation as the main reasons for colony losses. So what that says to me is that poor nutrition means that the quality of the nectar and pollen wasn't high enough, and starvation means that the quantity, there wasn't enough. So these are the two things I want to look at when I'm looking at the nectar and pollen provided by our urban trees. So I'm going to look at how much nectar and pollen is produced by flowers of different tree species. And I'm going to look at the macronutrient content, so the nutrients provided by the nectar and pollen of our urban tree species. I'm going to use the same methods, so climbing the trees and kind of using a long tree climbing pole, tree pruning pole to collect my nectar and pollen samples. And I'll be analysing them for the quantity and quality. So just to show you some pictures of what we did in our pilot studies. So this is how we analysed how we collected the nectar samples. So you have to put a mesh bag over your flower samples because flowers constantly refill with nectar all the time. So a bee might come and have a drink of nectar, and then the flower will refill over a set period of time. So I don't want to sample a flower if a pollinator's just drank from that flower and it's kind of depleted the nectar. So you have to bag the flower, like you can see in that top picture, to prevent any pollinators from drinking from that nectar. For 24 hours, it allows the flower to refill, and then I can sample the nectar. So if you look, this is a rhododendron flower that I took from Heaton Park, and I'm not sure if you can see, but there's a little tiny glass tube in here, and you stick these little glass tubes into the nectary where the nectar is produced just down here, and it just sucks all of the nectar up into the tube, and you can measure how much nectar there was inside the flower. You can also put the nectar, a little drop of nectar on this measuring tool called a refractometer, and you kind of put your eye at that end and hold it up to the light, and this is what you can see, and it measures the concentration of the nectar. So from that you can get the volume and the concentration of nectar produced by different tree species. And then this is how we do the pollen sampling. So you take flower buds, closed flower buds from trees, because unlike nectar, there's a set amount of pollen in the flower, and that doesn't replenish. So you want to take closed flower buds so that no insects will come and take any pollen from the flower, and you let them open under controlled conditions, and then you cut the stamens off, which is what this is here, and that's where all the pollen is held in the flower. And then under a microscope you can count how many pollen grains there are. So I think this is lime pollen. So these are what pollen grains look like under a microscope. So from that you can work out how many pollen grains have been produced per flower of different tree species. And then really quickly, just to go over the quality, so looking at the macronutrient content of the nectar and pollen. So macronutrient content has been found to be really important for different things for pollinators. So it's been found to affect honeybee immune response, tolerance to parasites, and tolerance to disease and pesticide exposure. So the three macronutrients are lipids, carbohydrates, and proteins. And these are just pictures of, in the lab, how we sample, how we look at how much macronutrients are in each different nectar and pollen produced by different tree species. I won't go into this too much, but you can ask me about this at the end if you're interested. So what I'm hoping to end up with is a big list of all the urban tree species, how much nectar and pollen they produce, the macronutrients in the nectar and pollen they produce, and the interactions between the tree species and the pollinators. So what I'm hoping this will do is help us create evidence to create better tree planting strategies for pollinators in urban areas. So to say this tree is best for this species, or if we want to increase this pollinator species in this area, this might be a good tree species to plant. And hopefully, if we can kind of prove that they're really important for pollinators, this could provide evidence to prevent unnecessary tree felling. I'm doing just a little plug, I'm doing a exhibition with a local illustrator on some of the pollen work we've been doing. It's called Foraged Codes, and it's just at Shieldfield Artworks. If anyone is interested in looking into that more, it's on Shieldfield Artworks website. Thank you for listening.